Okay, we are live. Um, Sorry we're a little late.
Technical difficulties.
Technical difficulties. We know how it goes. We always know how it goes. That's one of the reasons why I try not to do these live so much, because I always end up having more technical difficulties, I think, than not. So usually I try to schedule them out. But I'm really excited for this one today because we have an amazing historian, Jen from Walk with History. We've collaborated on a few things, so I'm excited to have you back. I think it's been probably a year since I've had you on
Yeah.
the show, since I've had you on the podcast. I mean, I know we've like done things
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
together, but I don't think we've done the podcast for a while. And so I was excited to have you come on because all this week is a theme, and it's Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
We've got the 7th coming up pretty quickly. I think it's the 82nd anniversary. I could be off, but we are losing our veterans, our World War II veterans, every day. Pretty soon, in the next couple of years, we won't have any of them with us. And actually, I correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we had just lost maybe the last Pearl Harbor survivor,
Mm-hmm.
a pilot. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but I think he had just passed in April.
Yes.
So and I know we definitely have lost the last survivor from the USS Arizona. So we are starting to get into a phase in history now where we're not just years removed, we're generations removed. And I had posted a video of the USS Arizona, and then it was a dramatization. I think it was from the movie Pearl Harbor, of the scene
Mm-hmm.
where the USS Arizona gets hit by the torpedo and it explodes. And then it fast forwards to today in the USS Arizona Memorial, and a aircraft carrier coming through the harbor, saluting.
Manning the rails. Manning the
Yeah,
rails.
saluting them. Yeah, and you're a Navy veteran as well, so I'm sure you know
Mm-hmm.
all those terms. But you know, I had a few comments in there from history teachers. One in particular is a guy that I know that had taught history, and he doesn't teach history anymore. But he said it was so difficult to teach these things because the kids today, they just don't care.
Yeah.
They just don't care anymore. And I was thinking a lot about that. How do we change that in American history? How do we change that in American culture? How do we get children to understand the importance of these events and the things that happened? And I did post another video that's kind of controversial.
Sure.
Someone's Gen D's thought that, Pearl Harbor happened in the 1960s, and,
Mm-hmm.
kind of made a little satirical joke about it. But at the same time, it's, for me, I was just really thinking about that a lot today, about how we are becoming so more removed, and what are some ways that you think we can remember Pearl Harbor and keep that kind of in our thoughts, especially as we celebrate its anniversary this week?
Yeah. So Pearl Harbor, for me, Lisa, and I say controversial things too. I think it's the only day that lives in infamy. I don't think you can compare it to any other day. I think
Mhm.
today, if you want to compare it for a student who is like the fear you would feel in a school shooting, that emergent fear of being under attack, multiply it by 1,000, multiply
Mhm.
it by 5,000. That's what the people felt, not only in Pearl Harbor that day, but in America that day.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to even relay what that was like to be there in that moment. When you think of Japan then, Japan today, they're two different countries. You would have to be like, we were being attacked by a world power. So Russia was attacking us, or China was attacking us today.
Yeah.
That's the amount of fear you would feel. That's the amount of power they would have. That's the amount of annihilation they were going to leave behind on us. And so I tell you this, Lisa, because when we talk about things happening today in history and people saying stuff and doing stuff, I always say we're not doing our job, right?
Right.
Because you and I need to do this job to relay this to people so they understand it. So they're not putting it into context of what they know today and taking away the context of the history it was then,
Mm-hmm.
right? So 1940s, Pearl Harbor, the Pacific Fleet has been moved from San Diego all the way to Pearl Harbor. FDR had done that. So it's a lot of battleships. And this is what the Navy was in the 40s, battleships, right? We weren't the carrier Navy we are today. Pearl Harbor will change that,
Yeah.
right? We weren't
So why does he, I'm sorry, Jen, I don't mean to cut you off. Why does FDR decide to move the fleet out of California and move it into Hawaii? Why did he make that decision to do
so
that?
there had been, since the lead up in the 1930s, late 1930s, early 1940s, Japan had been exercising their muscle the same way Germany was exercising theirs, right?
Yeah.
So Japan was hitting French Indonesia. They were taking the French Indies. They were expanding their empire. And FDR felt that these were our not quite allies at the time, but friendlies, right? And we traded with them. And so we started to stop trading war materials with Japan. And at
Mm-hmm.
first they were okay with that. But when we took away aviation fuel from Japan, they got mad.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
they were like, they took that as hostile.
Right.
And then there tried to be some negotiation about it. There tried to be some messaging. FDR refused to meet until some agreement was met. I think they wanted to meet to work on an agreement. So you really have this communication gap here that's not working, right? And so Japan, I would say even early in 1941, they had already started planning the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, I think another thing that we need to remember is Japan gets a new prime minister as well, a
Yeah.
very nationalist prime minister, and they're in the middle of waging an invasion in China. So
Yes.
for us to put on an oil embargo on Japan was very detrimental to their effort in trying to expand their imperialistic, nationalistic goals. Um, but so we know that this is happening. We know that hostilities are high, and of course they're trying to find a diplomatic um, solution to this in DC. But in the meantime, FDR decides he's moving the fleet to Pearl Harbor. And is it purely in and this is where I think a lot of people start to kind of speculate on FDR's motives here. Is it in a pure kind of, just we need to defend the Philippines, our interests here in case there is something, or is there some kind of inkling that an attack is imminent on our front?
So there's a lot of history about that, right?
Yeah.
What right? What intel did we have? And were we aware? And was FDR trying to stage an entrance into the war, right? I would say clean entrance into the war,
Yeah.
right? I don't think that was happening. I think there's a lot of chatter and there's a lot of things that get missed in hindsight, right? I do not think, I mean, the Japanese did send out a message right before, and they claim it was a declaration of war. But if you read it, it's very like, we don't like you anymore. And I think I'm going to take my ball and go home. Like, that's
Yeah.
what it reads like. It's
Yeah.
not really a declaration of war. They claim it's a declaration of war. And I'm like, it doesn't read like that. And even if they deciphered it probably a couple hours before Pearl Harbor, and they were like, something's happening, but we're not sure what. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they had this intel and they sat on it. I think it's more like you said. I think the FDR, there's hostilities going on. What's happening in China is really what pulls us into the beginning, because there's a massacre that happens in China in 1937 where they kill civilians. The Japanese kill civilians in China. and so different today, right? So
Yeah.
we go out there, we're calling them out on war crimes, right?
Hmm.
So I think he puts the fleet out there as a show of muscle, as a show of might, as to protect the Philippines. MacArthur is out there in the Philippines, right? I think he's just trying to, give a little more cushion
Yeah.
to, uh, mainland America, and
Hmm.
fleet out in Hawaii. So I do not think, and I think modern historians who really study this will agree that there was no shadiness going on, sitting on things. I do not think America would ever let that happen. Uh,
Yeah.
I think it was just, hindsight again, but the Japanese were very not clear in their intentions, even when they were putting stuff out. They really wanted the surprise. It worked to their advantage.
Yeah, so let's talk about this surprise attack by them, because I was looking at kind of some of the things about looking into some of those things about Pearl Harbor. So we have a pretty good, like, minute to minute analysis of how everything went down with Pearl Harbor, which is great, which is, something is like a historian's dream. It's like I heard a historian that says, if you want to know something, you need to put things in chronological order, and it will tell you most of the story, right? So, I think for us as Americans, we tend to forget that World War II didn't start on December 7th, 1941. I
Mhm.
mean, this war had been going on for years. We know that Britain was tired in fighting the war, and I think that's one of the other reasons that speculate, why just so happened to be. But FDR, he ran for his third term, and he ran on, we are going to stay out of this war. We are going to remain neutral. We had been supplying the Allies with things in their war effort, but we weren't going to put boots on the grounds in any way, shape, or form. That was very much a sentiment that people did not want to enter a war in a foreign country. They were very much, no, we don't want to do this.
Yeah, that's his famous speech. If you go to the Roosevelt Memorial, "I hate war" is
Hmm.
one of his famous speeches he gave in New York State while he was campaigning.
Yeah.
How much he wanted to stay out of the war.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. And I mean, so I think, there's some speculation there that he needed something
Yeah.
in order to get us in. But I'm with you. I don't necessarily think it was an orchestrated event. I'm just going to call the conspiracy out. I don't think that it was an orchestrated event by our United States government. Not that I'm saying that governments haven't done that before, but I don't think Pearl Harbor is one of those things, just looking at the history of it all. But we know that, so we are sitting in Pearl Harbor.
Mm.
It's December 7th,
Yep.
early in the morning. It's
Yep.
like what is it? It's like a Sunday or a Saturday. It's a weekend.
Yeah, it's a weekend. Lots of.
So all the, officers are off. People
Mhm.
are not really, up for duty
No.
chores and stuff like they normally would be. Um, which is very strategic on Japan's part to choose a weekday to
Mm.
to get this attack going. But they get off like at 6 a.m.
Hmm.
The ships do. And something that I've looked into, but I don't understand, is they had deployed, Japan had deployed submarines.
Hmm.
But when you look at the like the attacks, the after report, there are no submarines in Pearl Harbor.
So, we were stationed at Bellows. When I grew up I lived in Japan for 4 years. I mean, I lived in Japan, I lived in Hawaii for 4 years.
Hmm.
School there. And my parents were stationed at Bellows Air Force Base. So your husband's Air Force, right, Lisa?
Hmm.
Bellows Air Force Base is the best deal you can get in the Navy. It's an MWR base.
Mm.
It's recreation. My parents were security on Bellows, and Magnum PI would film on the base because you could keep
Oh
this.
yeah.
So my parents would work security for Magnum PI. So this is the 80s, right? But their big claim to fame, Bellows is the most right-hand side of Oahu, is they caught one of those first submarines from Pearl Harbor.
Mm.
caught the first prisoner of war for Pearl Harbor because it washed ashore to Bellows Beach. So
Oh,
yeah, they deployed 5 like mini subs. Almost think of them like what they used in the Civil War.
yeah,
Not kind of what, it's not the subs we had, right?
yeah.
Like these mini 2-man subs that you can kind of get in shallow water and they can release torps. They released 5 of them. And
Okay.
not do, I mean, they got some torps off. And they do believe they hit like the Utah and I think the Tennessee,
Okay.
but they found wreckage of the 5th one. They blew themselves up, right? Like it was very much kind of like a Civil War thing, right? So the one that they cut off Bellows, they hit coral reefs because I don't think they were realizing all the coral reefs that are around Hawaii shore.
Hmm.
And they hit a coral reef out of Bellows. There was a 2-man sub. The commanding officer told one guy to get out and swim for shore. He ended up drowning. The commanding officer ended up getting the sub aground, and they arrested him right then. And that's
Hmm.
pretty early in Pearl Harbor. So they're kind of like, what's happening right now, right? So yes, they do have submarine warfare. It's not anything near as what America had at the time.
Yeah.
It's very archaic, right? They do get off some torps, but most of their torps are released by the aircraft. And that's the biggest damage was done by the aircraft. But they do have there is some submarine warfare there. But it
Mm.
very, and that first sub that was caught is in a museum in Texas.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I would have no idea we would have kept that. But okay, so the submarine aside, because I wanted to say that because when I was looking at the timeline, one of our ships was out there a few days before, I think, Pearl Harbor, and had reported that they might have seen a submarine telescope.
Sure, Periscope.
A periscope, yeah, but they weren't sure if that's what it was. But they did report that they had seen something like that out in the ocean. And I think that and that was a few days before Pearl Harbor. And I'm wondering how long it took those submarines to even get over there.
It's funny. Like, is this like the Henley? Like, what was
I
that?
know. Yeah, yeah. Well, let's talk about the battle itself.
So if you go to Pearl Harbor, if you go today, I mean, first of all, I bought the newspaper. I think everyone should have the newspaper. It is an impressive newspaper, war declared in America, right? It's the only time we've ever been under attack like that to that magnitude besides 9/11. And you walk in and it hits you. They just go USS Arizona, USS Oklahoma, USS West Virginia, USS Cal, and they hit you with all the battleship, like boom, boom, right away. So you really are feeling Battleship Row. Every is being annihilated, right? And like I said, this was the Navy of the 1940s, was battleships. This is what the way it comes from. This is what people think of the navies and their crackerjack, right? Like it's a battleship navy.
Yeah.
And you Battleship Row, you had these like 8-9 battleships all lined up beside each other. Made very easy targets, right? And
Yeah.
so hit them, it really was a very easy attack when you think about it that way. And like you said, it was a weekend. You got your officers off the ship. You have your enlisted men, usually your lower ranking enlisted men, on the ship because they don't have the money or the berthing to be off the ship. So they're sleeping in. You have guys who are up, who have duty for a mess or whatever, right? But most everyone's having a good time. It's Hawaii. And
Yeah, and let's and just before, like, let's talk about like Pearl Harbor. What the base itself, that particular location, as far as defense navally, like as Navy wise, is very strong. Okay, it would be very difficult for someone to bring in other ships and try and attack it.
So Oahu is kind of a it's not the big island, but it's like
Right.
second. And Pearl Harbor, if you kind of think of the island as one whole, Pearl Harbor is kind of like the southern middle. You kind of have harbor. It's Pearl Harbor. You go into the harbor. So everything is very protected by the whole island around it. And that's where you get Pearl Harbor, Hickam. Hickam Air Base is right there beside Pearl Harbor. You have 2 landing strips there. You have a submarine base there. A lot of the oil fields were there. The dry docks were there. Bellows Air Force Base is off to the right. You got Kaneohe Airstrip a little more to the north. You have a couple outlined, but really Pearl Harbor is your center of your Navy fleet. But it is protected because the harbor is protected. And again, you have to know how to sail, more or less the words, because it's a shallow harbor.
Yeah.
That worked to the advantage of these ships because when they sunk in shallow water. So, and they were able to be salvaged because of that. But you have to, when you come into the harbor, it's one of those where you really have to stay within the buoys because it's only drafted, enough for a ship to come in between those buoys. So you have to be pretty skilled, officer of the deck to do that. But yeah, so, when we man the rails, right, we go by the Arizona, we're coming in Pearl Harbor, we get in our whites and we stand on the edge of the ship and we salute the Arizona. And there's very few times you man the rails. I've only done it for Pearl Harbor and I've done it for a national cemetery coming into San Diego. And you have your whites on board. I'm telling people right now in the Navy, you ain't wearing your whites on the ship. That's not right. You're wearing your working uniform. You're wearing coveralls, khakis, if that's even more dressy. You're wearing flight suits, right? And so to get in your whites, usually you have it there ready to go for some kind of ceremony or something that might happen while you're underway. So you get in your whites and you man the rails and you salute as you pass. And it is, as a sailor, it is, I think, a very emotional thing, especially especially the Arizona. So, but that's what you're seeing when they're in their whites doing that.
That's very cool. That's very cool. So you think that there's some kind of, I think, like false sense of security at this point when it comes to Pearl Harbor, because it is so much of a natural defensive area. Aviation is still very new. The Army Air Corps is, newly formed. There is airfield there, but I don't think anybody was expecting Japan to fly these. Well, first of all, to get these, fighter pilots in range to fly to Hawaii, I think was one of the surprising things about it. So
yeah, I mean, the Doolittle raid, like we were just starting to experiment with being able to fly off of carriers, land on carriers, and use aviation to that.
yeah.
And that's why I say Pearl Harbor completely changed the face of the Navy. Right?
Yeah, so I think they use, I actually have the statistics right here. So Japan will use 353 aircraft in attacking Pearl Harbor. That would have been so scary, I think, to, just to put myself in that time frame in 1940s. This is a time that not necessarily commercial airlines are going off. They're not flying like we are now. I mean, this would be something that I feel like would have been really scary to kind of see coming at you from the sky, to see all of these planes, because this is a new medium that we're using in war so heavily for the first time, really.
We didn't do this. That's why I said it changed the Navy. It changed the Navy. The Navy was battleships.
Yeah.
Coming in kind of like the redheaded stepchild of the Navy. Submarines weren't even a big deal yet, right? It was the Germans were experimenting with subs, so we tried to keep up and experiment with subs, right? And then the Japanese, they're behind on the subs, but when it came to the aircraft carrier, so when you think of a carrier today and an air wing on a carrier today, and I think you have like 12 squadrons. Think each squadron has 10, 15 aircraft. That's not 353 aircraft is not even what one carrier would have today. It's almost what 3 carriers would have today. So for them to get all those aircraft over on their carriers and then to use them in the attack, I mean, really, it's genius, right? And
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's probably one of the reasons why it was so shocking.
mhm,
So
yeah.
it was so shocking. So anyway, so like I said, the timeline is very interesting on Pearl Harbor. So 6 a.m., the
Mhm,
first wave of planes, nearly 200 of them, take off from aircraft carriers. The Japanese Navy Pearl Harbor Strike Force is what that first wave is called.
mhm,
That is 275 miles outside north of Oahu. And I
wow.
think some of them don't even make it back. They
Sure.
just run out of fuel. I think they just do. I think some of them do. Um, the destroyer USS Ward fires on Japanese submarines at 6:45 a.m. These are the first shots of the United States in World War II. So I knew that there were subs somewhere. I just couldn't remember where.
Mhm.
Um, but this gives them a little bit of time. It don't you think that that would have given them a little bit of time to get prepared in Pearl Harbor?
Well, so they do to a certain extent, right? Because they do get people manning guns, right? They
Hmm.
do go out there. They do get people going to general quarters, right? Trying to run and get into battle stations and kind of get ready. They do get some of that going, right?
Hmm.
Not everybody's woken up from a slumber with a bomb coming down into their berthing, right? So they do get some general quarters, and people are able to get out there and start to man some um, some battalions. But the problem is these ships are all parked right beside each other, and like I said, it's a shallow harbor to get in and out, so you can't get all 8 ships out at one time.
Mm.
Underway, it's not like 2 seconds I can just get underway. Here we go, fire up the boilers and get the propellers going. Let's get underway. It doesn't work like that. You do have the Nevada, who good on the Nevada, who will get going and will run aground. They'll beach themselves.
Mm.
It's better than sinking. But
Right.
but these ships are basically sitting ducks. There's nowhere for them to go. They can't even if they were to get underway, they can't even get out. They have to go out single file.
Right. And I think this is also kind of like, you know how the Titanic was like a perfect storm of just events,
Mhm.
indicators that were ignored,
Yes.
things that were happening, and you kind of see that with Pearl Harbor. You see this, the Ward, he's calling back. We
Yes.
had an intelligence report, I think in January, earlier in the year, that was kind of poo-pooed, saying that this intelligence officer had an idea that they were planning Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
This was something on Japan's radar, and if
Mhm.
they were to do it, they're going to pull the trigger on it. We
Yep.
kind of ignored that. But then another thing is there is radar at this time,
Yes.
and these planes do show up on the radar, and they are ignored as being a group of American training planes that are out there, and there are American planes out there. In fact, there was 250 women that were killed in Pearl Harbor,
Mhm.
and one of the women that survived Pearl Harbor was a pilot, and she actually was training other pilots. I think
Mhm.
her name is Carolyn Holt. I'll have to look it up. I can't remember her name off the top of my head. She ends up passing away. She ends up dying in a training accident in the middle of World War II. Not
Wow.
in Pearl Harbor, but in World War II. But
I've
she was out there and saw those planes. She saw some of they called them meatballs, the rising sun on the wings. She saw
yeah.
the meatballs, and she um, radioed back, but they kind of ignored her again. So we have the radar that gets ignored. They think that it was a group of B-17 bombers that were out doing some kind of training exercise. So that gets ignored. By the time that's reported, those first Japanese planes are coming in at about 7:40 a.m. into Pearl Harbor. They reach Oahu.
48. Yep.
Um, and these kids, I call them kids because I mean, these were, 19, 18, 20-year-old kids that were either asleep in their bunks or doing, chores on the deck that needed to get done if they weren't on leave. And bombs start flying. Those first bombs start going, those first, torpedoes start going off, those first bombs start going off. I can't imagine how scary that would have been.
Yeah, I can only equate it to 9/11 and seeing the airliner flying into a building. It's just a impossible thing that you're seeing. And I think
Yeah.
that's why so many things were ignored. Because
Mhm.
it's an impossible but you're saying it's impossible, right? It's like me. I'm seeing a whole fleet of Japanese aircraft flying. They're like, hey, how did they get here? BS.
Yeah.
There's no way. Now, yeah, we know tensions are high with Japan, but we're working it out. We're trying to
Mhm.
work it out, right? They're going to attack us? Like, now we're not the world power that we are today. We become that after World War II, but we're still a pretty decent threat. So,
Yeah.
you know,
And
so
I think Japan also really kind of underestimated America as well. I think that they looked at America. First of all, Japan, like you said, Japan today is not the Japan of the 1930s and 40s. This was a very, this culture was very much a warrior style culture. This is, these are kamikazes were a real thing. They were going to die, live and die for their country, live and die for their culture. And they were in the process of like Germany, they wanted to expand their reach, expand their influence, expand because they felt that they were superior,
mhm,
especially to Americans who they looked at as, oh, you're just Hollywood,
yes.
you're just making movies,
Hmm.
you've grown soft as a culture, which is, I mean, I think a lot of people maybe underestimate that. They looked at us like we were soft. We weren't gonna do anything in retaliation. And so I think that they kind of felt it would be easy. It
Hmm.
would be easy to take out the United States before they even got started.
Oh yeah, like you said, all this honor and war. So they had an emperor at the time. Think of it as a very feudal system, right? With like a
Mhm,
So they believed everything their emperor did was the right thing. He was, ordained by God. So everything he says and does is, the holy is the right thing to do. So people very much of honor. And
mhm,
like you said, at the time, and even today, the mentality still kind of still rests that conquering land means more raw materials, more sources, more resources for our country. So Germany conquering and Japan was conquering. Think of how small the island is, and how much more they wanted to have.
mhm,
And because they have these economic systems that are feudal and more socialist, it's easier if you conquer the land to
mhm.
have those materials than to actually trade and capitalism. That's more difficult to do than to actually just conquer the land and have the resources and the labor from the people. That's easier.
Yeah.
That's what Japanese was. And their emperor, like after the war, they will lose their emperor. They did lose that whole system of governing. So, and they're much more today, like a republic, like we are. But
Yeah.
but before they're not. And so it's an honor to die, it's an honor to serve, it's an honor to be a warrior, just like you said. So you're fighting a different kind of enemy almost.
Mhm.
But they're smart and they have high technology, and they had planned this battle and they were very smart about it, and they were the ones to get all those aircraft onto those carriers and get them there. And they had made their torps with wooden fins, so they didn't go very deep into the water because they're going to hit these shallow draft battleships. And so they had the technology ready for a shallow draft harbor attack. That's
Yeah.
for. So they got us really, because we were not. I mean, to us, it was just a radical idea, right? It wasn't so much they weren't listening to the woman. I think even if a dude called and said, "Hey, I'm seeing all these aircraft," they'd be like, "What?" You know,
Right.
right? Like I just don't believe it was even in their radar that could happen.
Yeah.
And like you said, it was a Sunday, so people were like, "Really, I have to deal with this today?"
I know.
like, so I think they've all worked in their favor. But like you said, they thought America, it would demoralize us.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They thought we are this honor. It would demoralize us so bad that we would run home with our tail between our legs, and we would be so demoralized, and we would give up. And it's Americans are exactly the opposite, right? We
Yeah.
are capitalists. We are Hollywood. You mess with us, you rattle the cage, you're going to get a fight you weren't expecting, right?
Right.
And that's exactly what happened. Instead of demoralizing us, Pearl Harbor is used as propaganda for the rest of the war.
Oh, yeah.
Pearl Harbor will be used even after the war. Pearl Harbor, the Arizona Memorial, we'll talk about Elvis Presley, is used even later in life for even culture. And so it's very much like it was exactly the opposite of what they were expecting. That's what they were hoping to happen. And instead, our guys in the shipyards worked 24 hours a day for a year to get those ships back up and going.
Yeah.
I mean, it made women go into the workforce. People just pulled up their pulled up their bootstraps and raw materials, whatever it took, right? War bonds, get people out there. It mobilized our country in a way that we've never really seen. Even after 9/11, we've never really seen like what happened after World War II.
Yeah.
That declaration, like that really, America came together. We had one focus. We really we sacrificed as a country. We grew technology, and it really was something that I think that's why they call it the greatest generation. Made America what it is today. Gave us the reputation we have today, and it really did. Like it changed the military, changed the Navy, and to me, I always say what made me join the military is really images of World War II. Even for me, the propaganda worked. So
Yeah. One thing I really want to talk about too is the casualties
Mhm.
or not the casualties, but the deaths at Pearl Harbor would not have been as high
Yep.
if the USS Arizona did not explode. It
Yeah.
essentially exploded, killing 1,177 sailors.
It's almost half of the casualties.
It makes up a big majority of those that were killed.
Mm.
Um, something that I grew up in Arizona.
Yeah.
So Arizona is a big deal, and the USS Arizona was a big deal. And I went back to, and if you can watch my video on this, but I went back to the Arizona State Capitol this summer, and I was shocked at how much of the USS Arizona is at the Arizona State Capitol.
Sure.
Like they have, well, in the state of Arizona, there are pieces of that ship scattered throughout the state.
Mm-hmm.
They have one of the guns from the USS Arizona is at the state capitol. It's right next to one of the guns from the USS Missouri. So they kind of bookend the beginning and the end of the war.
Sure.
They have one of the 3 anchors that were from the USS Arizona there.
Yeah.
They have one of the flags that flew that was salvaged off of the ship. They have one of the pieces of the ship. They have a big metal piece that was salvaged off of the ship. And they have, and soldiers or sailors have donated
Mm-hmm.
so much to it after. But when I was there, I was shocked to find that there were 36 pairings of brothers or father and son on the ship. And only 15, I think it was only 15 of them survived the attack.
Wow.
So it was either one of them survived, and very rarely did 2 of them survive. But that also was one of the reasons why the Navy in particular went, okay, we're not going to have family members
Mm-hmm.
aboard the same ships. We're not going to have family members in the same battalions. we're not going to have them. We're going to have to split them up, because before you used to be able to serve with your brother,
Hmm?
like Gettysburg, the Chamberlain boys were both in Maine.
Yep.
You used to be able to do that, but Pearl Harbor really made the military realize, oh my gosh, we're going to go into this war. We have to separate family.
Mm-hmm.
And I kept thinking about Saving Private Ryan, okay, all her boys are gone now. They have to go get the remaining
Yeah.
son that survived, and how devastating that must have been
Yeah.
to families. Not only was this, oh my gosh, we have, all of these casualties and there's all of these family, but now entire families are devastated by this. They didn't just lose one son, they lost two sons, or they lost a father and a son, and how difficult that must have been for them. Another thing that I thought was really interesting was that there are 68 civilians that died at
Yep.
Pearl Harbor, and we never talk about the fact that there were civilians involved, 11 of them being children. So, I've never been to Pearl Harbor, but I know that it's an island, and islands aren't usually that big. And when things like that start going off, there's going to be some kind of civilian casualties, and we had them
Mm-hmm.
at Pearl Harbor. Our servicemen and women being lost is one thing, but to have actual civilians and children die must have also touched a chord with people as well. That must have been so devastating, because I remember 9/11 being so devastating because it wasn't a military installation.
Yes.
We were like, if it was a military base, I think that the public would have been okay. That it's not.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Bagram got shot at all the time. You know what I mean? Like, our bases get attacked all the time. But the fact that this was civilian and this is where people lived, and
Mm-hmm.
that it wasn't just Pearl Harbor, but the entire town was
Yeah.
essentially under attack. I
Yes.
mean, that must have been so scary and so incredibly shocking to the
Yes.
American public.
So Pearl Harbor, right when you have Battleship Row, right, like across, like you can see battleships, is like nice housing, right? Like there's housing there. And so any stray bomb or stray bullet, even when I would go over to Hickam, as when we lived there, they still keep the bullet holes on the buildings.
Mm,
Bullet holes from Pearl Harbor are still on those main buildings. I know the hospital still had the bullet holes from Pearl Harbor. My
wow.
mom out those the bullet holes from Pearl Harbor. Like they want you to see that this was an attack on the base. It wasn't
Hmm.
an attack on the battleships. This was an attack on the military installation. And you do have civilians who work there, and you do have families who live there. And so, yes, those casualties are added to it. It's, this is where you get, though, and I want to say, one of the things that comes out of Pearl Harbor is these Japanese internment camps. This is a big knee-jerk retaliation from Pearl Harbor, because people were just so amazed this could happen. It was such a secret. And you have Japanese Americans living in Hawaii, you have Japanese Americans living on the Pacific coast. And people, because it's such an honor system and a feudal system in the Empire of Japan, people didn't know if you could let go of that patriotism, of that national.
Yeah, it was like you didn't know who to trust. You
Yes.
didn't know who was a spy. You didn't know,
Yes.
and yeah, another dark chapter in American history, that knee-jerk reaction, unfortunately. Somebody asked, do you think that Japan notified Germany, that Germany knew that Japan was going to do this?
Oh my gosh, I did read something about.
I don't think they did. I
I
don't
don't.
think Germany did know.
Yeah, I don't think they knew specifics. I don't even think so. This is interesting. Is like when this happened and America is attacked by Pearl Harbor, the British automatically declare war on Japan. They declare war on Japan before we do, because Churchill can just do it so much faster, right? We have a lot more protocol, FDR, right? This is why FDR is like, this is the day he lives in infamy. It's not just the attack on Pearl Harbor, it's how do I do this in front of Congress, right? How do I ask for a declaration of war? It really hasn't had to happen before, right? So he's saying a day in infamy for two reasons. But Churchill's able to be like, what? We're declaring war on Japan. So it's interesting. The British declared war before we are even able to do it. I don't know if they told Germany. I think, Japan had their own goals during the war, and they had, they wanted to conquer their own areas. I think I think Germany was free, let them kind of have free reign, like, this is your area, so you do what it takes to get
Yeah, I don't think I don't think I mean, the Allies, we were so in partnership, but I don't think that the Axis was so in partnership. They had their own political goals. They had their own cultural goals.
Yep.
I think sometimes we kind of think, okay, well, that's the bad guys, and they're all on the same team. When it was clear they weren't all on the same team. They were just like, okay, you do your thing over there in Asia. I'm going to continue to do my thing over here in Europe.
Yeah.
And I don't think that they were communicative. They weren't communicating like, the Allies were sharing intelligence and things like that. Maybe Italy and Germany were sharing intelligence a little more. But I mean, I think Japan was so far removed from those guys.
Yeah, I do agree. I don't think I've never read anything where the National Socialist Party was aware of the attack on Pearl Harbor. I think it was just more like, that's your space and you do whatever you do, and we support you.
Yeah, there you go. So Nick said, was it true that Churchill slept the best after the attack because he knew the U.S. will get involved in war?
I did hear that.
I will say, I am sure it was a relief to Churchill. Because, I mean, I have read some of the letters between Roosevelt and Churchill. They were spread, especially Britain, they were spread incredibly thin. They had been fighting this war for 3 years. They were moving, at this point, they were moving into the Middle East more heavily. They really had to defend the Suez Canal, and you had, what's his name? Not Goebbels. Desert Fox, what is his name? The German officer. Somebody knows it. Somebody knows in the
I'll look it up.
Well, he was getting more involved in Africa, and then you also had Mussolini, who was trying to take over. Goebbels. Was it Goebbels? No.
Rommel. M-O-M-R.
Yes.
Rommel. Is that
Rommel. Right? Yep. And you also had Italy that was trying to, reconquer the Mediterranean. So I think Churchill was at this point in the war, Britain was very, very, very thin, and they were essentially fighting on their own. They were taking on Italy and Rommel. Yes, they were taking over Italy. They were taking on Italy and Germany virtually on their own, really.
Declared war so fast.
Huh?
Which is probably why he declared war so fast. He's like, I'm with America. We got you.
Come on. It's time to come in now. Like, come help us. We need your help. We can't.
Declare war in Japan, because I know you're going to declare war in Japan in a couple hours. So
yeah. Well, also, I think Japan was probably, because the thing is, at that time, you had the British Commonwealth. That was not as independent as it is now.
Yeah.
So Britain had to defend Australia. So whatever was happening in the South Pacific, I mean, they were going to have to get involved.
Well, that's what MacArthur uses, because the Philippines are going to be attacked a couple hours after Pearl Harbor. So just remind people, like, this wasn't just Pearl Harbor. They attacked the Philippines. Any place America had interest, MacArthur had to flee, right? And he fled Pearl Harbor, went to Australia. And so that's where he got his home base. So he was protected by the British there, and that's where they start the whole island hopping campaign from. So there is kind of like this shared kinship, right? We're going to use the Commonwealth there to regroup and start heading back to the areas that were attacked by Japan, because Japan They were smart. They didn't just do Pearl Harbor. They were doing all those islands along the way too.
Yes, yeah, I mean, they were trying to conquer and get some of that oil rich
Mm-hmm.
and those minerals that are there on those islands in the southeast. And and I, like I said, within 30 days of the attack on Pearl Harbor, over 100,000 men enlisted to the military.
Oh
Like
yeah.
America was ready to go. Like, and so people always ask, why did Japan decide to attack the United States? Why did they poke the sleeping giant? And for what I can decipher is that their goal was to decimate the fleet,
The fleet. Mm-hmm.
and there were a few things that they misstepped.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the Pearl Harbor, when you really look at it, could have been so much worse than it actually was. So what are some of the things that Japan failed to do that if they had done would have changed the tide of the war?
Oh gosh. I mean, and they were so close. They could have hit those oil reserves. If they would have hit all that fuel reserve, that's what
Yeah.
okay. If they would have hit that fuel reserve and they would have hit our dry docks, that would have been it for the US Navy. Because the reason the US Navy is able to recover quickly is our carriers are out to sea. 3 carriers out to sea, right? They hit the battleships, what at the time is the heart of the Navy. And they decimate the battleships. But because they don't hit our fuel reserves, we can still fuel our subs and we can still fuel our carriers. They don't hit the subs too. So those are the 3, like they're missing those 3 big things. The Navy just regroups. Okay, you got our battleships. You know what? We're going to become an aviation military. We're going to become a submarine military. When's the last time you saw a battleship in the US Navy? Right? We got frigates, we got cruisers, destroyers. I've been a destroyer sailor, I have been a frigate sailor.
Mm-hmm.
We fire our guns. It's fun, but it's the carrier that is the thing that people fear the most. Right?
And those carriers, that I think was a huge intelligence failure on Japan's part to do this attack without verifying that those carriers were in port.
Yeah. And we were able, like I said, so quick, 100,000 men enlist. We have so many people in those dry docks. We have all the fuel we need. So they just start salvaging those ships. Every ship of the 8 ships that are bombed in Pearl Harbor, 6 get back out there.
Yeah.
6 are able to be fixed and get back out there. The Utah, they can't fix it. Kind of, they make it a reef, and the Arizona they leave as a permanent tomb. But everything else they're able to salvage. And like I said, they're working in those dry docks 24 hours a day. Those men are, welding and hauling, and they're getting those ships back out to sea. It's amazing. And
Yeah.
then we're like, okay, the Japanese could do it. We can do it. If they got those aircraft on those planes, we can do that. Right. So that was the whole thing. Like if they can do it, we can do it. So, and then the submarine warfare, our submarines, our technology was, like I said, we're going toe to toe with the Germans at the time, who are really ahead in submarine technology, and they didn't hit our subs. And that's another thing that really helps in the Pacific side. So those 3 things, if they would have hit those 3 things, which they were right there, they're right beside the harbor.
Yeah.
Like they're right there. They could have annihilated that. And because they didn't, and I'm telling you what, those dry docks help at the Battle Midway. They saved the Yorktown. Like we're able to turn the tides of the Pacific War because of those dry docks.
Yeah.
In Hawaii. So
Admiral, this site was interesting. Admiral Tadachi, he said that when he looked back, he said, "We won a great tactical victory at Pearl Harbor and thereby lost the war."
Yeah.
Because they didn't go back a third time. They did it 1 wave, a second wave. They could have done a third wave.
They should have.
But because I think they couldn't locate where those aircraft carriers were, they decided not to go back and do a third wave and risk losing more pilots. I think that was the reason.
It's one of those things, like, I've been talking a lot about Napoleon, right? And you've done some Napoleon. Napoleon, like when they're retreating, you don't let them retreat, right? Face them down and you take care of it, right? And the Japanese, basically what the Japanese did, and I don't know if it's an honor thing, is they let us retreat, right? They let us have a chance to limp back, and that limp was enough to rejuvenate everything and to
Yeah.
much stronger fleet and to build a much stronger military. And like he said, I believe we awoken a sleeping giant. Well, you have. That's what our morale is different than imperialism morale, right? We're not doing this for an emperor. We're not doing this for honor. We're doing this because we believe in each other, because
Right.
we our country, we believe in our brothers, we believe in our fellow people, and that motivates us all to sacrifice and to be all in. So, yeah, but those three, I think it's those big three things. Like it's the oil reserve system, the oil, the fuel, the dry docks, the submarines. Those been hit. They could have. The third wave, like I said, they were right beside Battleship Row.
Yeah.
And that would have blown sky high. Like you want to talk about casualties, like.
Yeah. Well, okay. So of all the vessels that were involved, just some stats before we go. So there were the ships that were damaged and repaired. You had the USS California, the USS West Virginia, USS Ogalla mine layer, USS Shaw, which I couldn't even believe because that video that everyone shows of the ship blowing up, that's not the USS Arizona, that's Shaw. And then there's the USS Maryland, USS Nevada, which you said actually made it out of the harbor or ran aground.
Yeah, they're in the back. They actually get underway. We call it underway when you can get the ship going, and they just run aground. So they sink into the harbor. They actually are able to run their ship aground, which is even better to salvage the ship.
So did the USS Nevada, did they have their officers on board? Is that how they were able to like really get up and going? I don't know I don't know what it takes to get these battleships up and going at a moment's notice. You know what I mean?
So,
like I would assume it takes some kind of preparation. Like these are kind of big, heavy things, right?
people in the engineering spaces, of course, because you're going to get the boilers going. You have to get the steam going. Today we're nuke powered. So you do need engineers, but most people are standing a watch in those spaces. You have people who are in there. And then underway, you need an officer of the deck, you need a conning officer, but most people can do those jobs and still kind of do them and talk and do them. So I think people kind of manned the jobs that needed to be manned, right? And I think there were enough people on board. You usually have a duty section on board. You will have an officer on board. You will always have an officer who's like, they call it a CDO today, a duty officer. But at the time, I'm sure they'd had somebody, but they were able to get underway. So that means they were able to get the boilers going. They were able to get enough steam to get propulsion, and they were able just to run aground straight. Basically, so if you look, it's basically just straight ahead, boom, right? But it saves you from sinking, right? And if you look at the amount of draft, amount of water there is in Pearl Harbor, I mean, the Arizona sinks straight down, and the stacks are still sticking out of the water. They eventually cut them off, but it's enough to submerge the entire battleship, right? So that's a pretty significant enough to get the whole ship underwater. So to salvage it, to get it afloat again, is going to take more energy than if you just ran it aground and be able to back out with tugs. So what they did was basically they were able to get that ship underway quicker because they were able to save it from sinking.
Okay, so that's good to know. The Tennessee, Pennsylvania. Wasn't so the Pennsylvania, the Shaw, the Cassin, Downs, those were all in dry dock when it hit. The USS Helm, which was a destroyer, the USS Helena was a light cruiser, the USS Honolulu was also a light cruiser, the USS Riley, the USS Curtis, the USS Vestal was a repair ship, and that survived. Now the ships that were a total loss. Obviously, the USS Arizona, it is still in the harbor. The USS Oklahoma and the USS Utah. Now those two capsize in the
Mhm.
harbor.
Yeah.
And that's kind of, if you've seen any archive footage, you see all of that. You see that there. The USS Arizona, though, I want to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Yes. Let's
So
talk.
because there was 101, I keep saying it's 100, but 1,177 men on board, I don't think they were able to salvage many, if any, of the bodies that were trapped inside, for sure. So what the USS Arizona is a war grave.
Yes.
And interestingly, 44 of their former shipmates that survived have elected to be entombed with their crewmates.
Yes.
That is so,
Yeah. Mhm.
yeah, that is so cool, to me. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so protected,
Mhm.
and I don't know if people realize how many souls, how many people are entombed in the USS Arizona. Like it's not just a sunken ship. It is a burial at this point. It is a grave.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and I think that a lot of people, if you look on like Natural Geographic, it's more of a question on how to preserve this ship.
Yes, because it leaked. I don't know if it's still leaking oil
It's
today,
still leaking oil. Yeah.
or even when I was there. And it's just like the Titanic to some regard, where it's being eaten by the water and the rust, and it'll slowly disintegrate.
Yeah.
So how to preserve it, how to save it, and how to memorialize it. So I kind of want to talk about the USS Arizona Memorial. That's okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I always like, so again, this, Lisa, I got my master's University of Memphis, right? And Memphis, I never knew what the heck was in Memphis until I moved there. And, Graceland's in Memphis. I'm like, oh yeah, the king, he's from Memphis, right? And so I go to, Graceland. Every time a friend comes into town, I want to go to Graceland, right? So I've been to Graceland a million times, right?
Mm.
Very first time in Graceland, they have this picture of the USS Arizona. And I'm like, why is this so important to Elvis Presley? I come to find out that in the 1950s, that was when they had a plan to create the Arizona Memorial, right? And then by 1960, less than half of the $500,000 that they needed had been raised. And there was an article that went into the LA Times in 1960, I think, that said, the Arizona Memorial is not going to be made. We just can't get the funds for it. And Elvis Presley read the article. And Elvis Presley was going to shoot Blue Hawaii in about a couple months. And he said, listen, give them a call. I'll do a concert. I'll do a concert in Pearl Harbor, and all the money will go to the USS Arizona. This is the 1960s. Elvis really hasn't done a lot of concerts later in life, but this is his movie career time, right?
Mm-hmm.
He flies out to Hawaii. He does this full concert on November 11th. I think it's 1957. It's the final concert. Wait, was it? I'm going to make sure I got the right date here. And no, here we go. March 25th, 1961 is when he does the concert. It's the last time he's going to slide across the stage on his knees doing Hound Dog. It's the last time he's going to sing a bunch of his old songs in concert. And he raises over $100,000 in this concert, and then gets enough momentum that people hear about this concert and want to see this concert, that they raise the rest of the money. And by the end of the year, they're able to start construction of the USS Arizona Memorial.
Wow.
Yep. So he took no money for it. He just did it because he knew that it was enough to raise enough awareness and get the Pearl Harbor Memorial built.
Yeah.
And for me, I mean, I like Elvis's music, but when I heard that about Elvis Presley,
Oh, really? You weren't a fan before?
I liked him, but I was like, for him to take his stardom
Yeah.
and his height and to use all of it to do something like that, it just to me showed what a selfless philanthropy that he believed in.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
love about Elvis Presley and the USS Arizona Memorial.
Well, I mean, he was a veteran as well, and I'm sure, living being in your, around the same age as I think most of these men were at Pearl Harbor, as Elvis Presley would have been, and hearing about that and seeing that, and
Mhm.
that must have been very touching for him, very, very personal for him.
Yes.
And so, yeah, and I hope to make it out there one day. I have not been to the USS Arizona Memorial. Let me know in the comments if you guys have been. I have not been. It's definitely a bucket list of mine to go and see that. And now that the USS Missouri is there at Pearl Harbor, it's kind of like you can see the beginning and the end
Yes.
now of the war. Is you go to the USS Arizona Memorial. This is the beginning of America entering World War II, and then go to the USS Missouri. And my grandfather was not on the USS Missouri, but he was on one of those ships, the Alfred, that was out
Yeah.
in the bay
Yeah.
when Japan surrendered. So he was there, and his brother enlisted, was one of those 130,000 that enlisted and died in the Pacific.
See the Navy?
Yeah.
Go. And I love the Navy.
Yeah. So my grandfather at 16, he had to get permission from his mother, and
Yeah.
she signed his draft card and everything.
Yeah.
And because he died right around Midway, right around during Midway, and I have his Purple Heart and I have some of his World War II medals.
Cool.
His name was Lorraine Carr,
Yeah.
Lorraine Golden Carr, and he died. I have his obituary and everything. And so my grandfather,
Oh,
16
yeah.
years old.
But people were very motivated to answer the call.
Yeah, and I think that was like, for me, it's like, I don't know how much I hope my kids understand that Pearl Harbor set a trajectory in their great grandfather's life,
Mhm.
in my father's life, in my life. Without Pearl Harbor, I mean, who knows where you would be, right? I mean, I think, Lorraine died at 20 years old. He didn't get to live a life. How sad that is.
It's a tremendously heartbreaking, but those men and the sacrifice is what won the war. And I will say this,
Yeah.
America, we are the one of, I think we are the only country, because I know England does not do this, to repatriate patriots. So we still today look for those men and
Yeah.
who have died in World War II. We are still looking for planes at the bottom of harbors all along the Indonesian islands, the Japanese islands, the Philippine islands. We repatriate graves to this day. We bring patriots home to this day. It is something America's government does. I've helped do it at MacArthur Memorial, but we're the only country that does that.
Mhm.
England is like, you are where you lay, but we want to bring you home.
Yeah.
I think that's our way of thanking that sacrifice, right? That
Yeah.
we still don't forget you today.
Yeah. That's wonderful. And that's a great way to end this hour. And so, Jen, thank you so much for coming on here and talking about Pearl Harbor with me. I mean, I'm really thrilled. I was so thrilled to talk about it and dive more into this and learn more about Pearl Harbor. These podcast episodes are I do them for other people, but they're really for me. Like, this is, for me to learn and to grow and to gain that knowledge on a subject, on something that I might have known a little bit about, but to take that knowledge even further. So thank you, Jen, for coming on
Hey, I
so
loved it.
much. Yeah, and go follow her. You are on Walk with History, but you also have Talk with History now.
Yeah, so the podcast is Talk with History. The YouTube long videos are Walk with History.
Yeah.
And then we're on Instagram too. We do little reels,
Right.
little snippets. But yeah, Lisa, like I enjoy this. We can't forget our history. And I know you and I take it seriously. Like this is our job to make sure people know the truth, the facts of the past, so you can remember and you can honor those who came before us. And I have no problem calling them the greatest generation, because I truly believe they are. And
Mm-hmm.
in doing what they did, answering that call.
Yeah. Yeah. We do. We owe them quite a lot.
Mm.
The outcome could have been so drastically different. And so we do owe them, like we owe them what freedoms we enjoy. So thank you so much. If you haven't liked the video, I think it's a given. Give the video a like, subscribe. I will see you guys in the next history hour, next video, next podcast. Go follow Jen with Walk with History. I will have her information in the description below, so go check her out. Thank you guys so much. Remember this 7th of December, Pearl Harbor, and hopefully you guys can remember more, and hopefully you learned some more. So thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you later.
Thank you.
Bye.